And today's presenters are Professor Richard M. Hall at School of Mechanical Engineering at Leeds University, and postdoc David Lunn from Leeds Biomedical Research Center, Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust. And what you're going to hear about today is some work done within an EU project called LifeLongJoints. The outline will be that I first give a short introduction to the Anybody modeling system, as we usually do in these webcasts. And anybody also plays a role in the things that you're going to hear today. Then Professor Hall will give some background on the LifeLongJoints project, and then David will tell about the large data set for functional assessment of total hip replacement patients. And then last, we'll do a questions and answers session. First, what is the Anybody modeling system? I'll do this quick for those who haven't heard about the system before. It's a software system for musculoskeletal simulation. What you give as input is motion data, measured kinematics, forces, and what you get as output are body loads, joint moments, muscle forces, and joint reaction forces. The Anybody modeling system is used in a wide variety of applications, from product design and optimization, ergonomic analysis, surgical planning and outcome evaluation, load cases for final element analysis, and movement analysis. And what you're going to hear about today is a mixture of many of these things. A typical workflow in the Anybody modeling system could look something like this. You would provide maybe your measured forces and motion. That could be, for example, from a mocap lab. You would then use either body models you built yourself or some of the body models that we already provide, and maybe some sort of environment that your model works with. In this case, there's an example of an exoskeleton. Combine all of these things in the modeling system, run the simulations, the inverse dynamics, muscle recruitment, to get the internal body loads, muscle forces, and joint forces. Finally, you can output these things, for example, for post-processing in final element tools, and you can even close the loop completely to do design optimization. With that, I'd like to introduce the first speaker today, Professor Richard M. Hall. Richard has an undergraduate degree in physics from the University of Leeds and a PhD from the University of Lancaster. He's currently a lecturer at School of Mechanical Engineering and Medicine at Leeds University. And Professor Hall is also the coordinator and main driver behind the LifeLongJoints project. So with that, Richard, I'm gonna see if you are online, and I'm gonna make you the presenter. Are you with us, Richard?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Morten. Good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be giving this lecture this evening. As Morten said, I'm the coordinator for LifeLongJoints, which was an €18.3 million grant awarded by the European Union to look at ways of improving longevity in hip replacements. Hip replacement and any form of artificial joint actually is the largest orthopedic sector in terms of economic value. It's roughly about £14 billion per annum in terms of worth. The other 50% is around things like fracture fixation plates, fixation pins, so on and so forth. The growth is expected to be about 3% per annum, but it's expected to be faster in growth for revision procedures than for primaries, and this is largely driven by the changes in the age demographics. So where patients are living longer, we're putting these particular components into patients at a younger age. So we run the risk of more failures. If you look at the figures in the US, there's about 1 million total hips and total knee replacements put in every year. Revisions are roughly 10% of that. So even though we often say that hip replacement and knee replacements are a very successful procedure, the sheer volume means that even a small percentage of failures actually quite a lot of numbers. And it's this 60,000 in total knee and 30,000 in total hip replacements that we actually want to reduce. The primary cause of failure in both hips and knees is loosening or pain secondary to wear. It's not because the joint wears out, but it's because we're shedding particulates into the joint space. And if it's for a polyethylene socket, we shed polyethylene debris, and this goes on to form osteolysis. So we lose bone around the prosthesis, and as we lose bone, the particular prosthesis becomes loose. And similarly for metal and metal components, although it's not the exact same route, in the end what we get is pain due to pseudotumors or metallosis. So in both cases, the biotribology, the way that the articulating surfaces interact, is a key consideration. So LifeLongJoints was set up to deliver functional silicon nitride coatings for articulating surfaces and interfaces of total hip replacements that will produce longer lasting implants. So it's not just about articulating surfaces, it's about modular interfaces as well. And what we were hoping to do was that this particular goal of this silicon nitride coating would reduce the risk of implant failure associated with wear and also synergistic wear and corrosion processes. So quite a tall activity. And one thing that we wanted to do, as well as develop a new type of coating for these prostheses, was also to develop new test methodologies that didn't just focus on the average or the median environment of a particular hip replacement, the loads and the motions that are applied to it, but also looked at the more extreme cases, the stumbling, the walking upstairs that a patient may do, and doing so would challenge a hip replacement. As you'd expect, there are a series of project aims and project objectives. The one that's of interest here, well, in fact, there's two. One is the production of in-silico tools for prediction of wear across pertinent parameter space. And the other one is the development of advanced simulation methodologies. And for that particular objective, what we're talking about here is not in-silico simulation methodologies, but simulated in terms of mechanical structures that one runs in the laboratory. The problem with these is that to gain one data point takes about 3 months worth of experimental work. What we want to do is be able to predict the wear in a considerably shorter amount of time and do it for different configurations of loads and motions. And this is where the in-silico tools come into play, and where we've interacted with Anybody technology to try and achieve this particular objective. There was 15 collaborations. Roughly half came from universities, including Imperial, who are not on this diagram but joined late. And there was a series of companies, as one would expect, a simulator manufacturing company, companies associated with coatings, and of course, Anybody technology were a key partner in this collaboration as well. We also had 2 hospitals on board, which gave us access to 2 patients, and David Lunn will talk about that later in this webinar. Again, there is a series of work packages, as one might expect from a project of this size. The one that will interest you is work package 3, which looks at the computational modeling and simulation of hip joint mechanics. And we try and using this information to try and predict the wear in these types of devices. So as well as being a coating development, there was also method development, and I think that's crucial for the ongoing success of this project, was that we were developing methods as well as developing coatings, and some of the methods have been formulated into SEN workshop agreements, and they are available for people to utilize. So in terms of that particular work package 3, there was a set of specific objectives around the development of a prototype whole body scale simulation model. We took some fluoroscopy based on analysis of gait to help us develop our models further. There was a validation of the body scale hip implant model using the data gained in 3.2. We looked at population simulations for adverse loading scenarios. Now, this is very important because what we're trying to do here is identify those features or those environments which run the greatest risk of high wear. We were also, in the last two components, we were developing and validating surface topology models, and we compare this to our simulation data. And lastly, and very lately, we've also looked at the computational prediction of implant wear using this multifaceted approach. And the technology that ABT provides is crucial to providing those loads and motions at the joint interface. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. So the next presenter here will talk about some of the things that happened in some of those sub-packages that Richard just spoke about. And the presenter is David Lunn. So David, I hope you are with us.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Perfect.
The word is yours, David.
Thanks. Yeah, so good evening, everyone, from here in the UK. Well, it's evening here anyway. And first of all, I'd like to pass on my apologies from Professor Tony Redmond, who unfortunately won't be able to join us in the webinar this evening. But I'll try and do some of his slides justice. So thanks to Morton and the guys at Anybody for giving myself the opportunity to show some of the work that we've been doing as part of Lifelong Joints. And thanks to Richard for giving us that overview of Lifelong Joints and what the overall aim of the project was. So our main overall aim as at Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust was to try and create a large data set of patient-specific waveforms of how they perform activities of daily living, so we could drive in silico and in vitro preclinical testing. So I'm just going to begin with an introduction and trying to show the motivation of how we approach this work and look at sort of the success and the revision rates of total hip replacements. Then I'll move on to the data collection methods that we've used in our motion capture lab before looking at some of the results from the patient stratification. And then finally, we'll go on to say how we've used Anybody technology to derive the joint contact forces before looking at some of the results that these joint contact forces have led to through the preclinical testing and the waveform development. And finally, because we've generated such a large data set, we do plan to actually release this data set for public use in future. And I'll just go through a bit of a walkthrough how we plan to release it and the and what data is already available, and I'll show you the medium that's available through. So to begin with, in the UK alone in 2016, there was over 90,000 primary total hip replacements. Now the primary total hip replacement is a very successful procedure. It alleviates pain from patients who are maybe suffering from osteoarthritis. It gives them back mobility and allows them to get back to performing their day-to-day lives. However, although it is very successful, these hips don't last forever. And currently at the 10-year mark, there is a 4.4% chance of a revision. And at the 20-year mark, this is increased to the 15% chance. And revisions aren't great because they're much more difficult procedure and much less successful than the primary total hip replacement. And certainly for patients 30, 40 years ago, the implant was probably good enough to just get them to walk into shops, but now patients, as Richard mentioned earlier, are living much longer. They're also increasing the demand on the hip implant as well. So from patients that we've seen in the lab, they've got back to playing sports rather than that, so they're taking up new sports and increasing that demand on the implant. And we know that the majority of these failures will be due to wear, and the wear is often a consequence of the use of the implant. But we don't truly understand, or we don't really test how our patients are actually using the implant preclinically. We know that the revision rates are linked to different patient characteristics, so all patients aren't just a single entity, and they walk, move, and do different activities of daily living. So this is what we want to explore within this study. So just taking a bit of a closer look at the revision rates and how they are affected by patient characteristics. So here, a study by Bayliss et al., a recent one, who've looked at the National Joint Registry database, and they've looked at the lifetime risk of revision. So we can see age at the bottom, we can see that the younger patients have a high percentage chance of revision in their lifetime. So looking at up to 30%. And then also this decreases as we get to 75 and above, there's less than a 5% chance of revision rate. Now, looking at ages is quite useful and interesting in itself, but for me, the most striking bit of this graph is the fact that there's a difference between our males and females. So there's something happening in the way our male patients move compared to our female patients move that are increasing the chance of a revision rate. And this is something that we want to explore within, or we did explore within the Lifelong Joints project. And we also see that BMI also affects the chance of revision. So we can see in the upper line on the graph here, the higher than 40 BMI have a much higher chance of revision compared to our lower BMI groups, and certainly the above the 30 to 40 BMI group compared to the other groups is slightly higher as well. And in this study, it was suggested that for every 1 BMI unit increase, there's a 2% chance, there's a further 2% chance of revision. So for this data particularly, we can sort of hypothesize why higher BMIs might have a higher revision rate. So we can say that the higher load from the increased rate would cause the increase in revisions. But we don't really know how these patients are functionally different other than an increased load. And furthermore, we wondered whether we would be able to predict these revision rates by improving or doing a more thorough preclinical testing. So by using these types of patients in the current preclinical testing. So if we look at how hips are currently tested preclinically for hip wear, we can see the standard ISO 14242, and we can see that it's a fairly stylized graph. So the waveforms are ideal for machines to run, but probably not typical of how our patients are actually moving. You can see it's only for walking, and it's simply a 3 kilonewton axial force that's applied. And when we delve into this data a little bit more, we can see where these waveforms that are used to drive preclinical testing simulators was derived from. So it was from a study by Paul in 1967, where he used a bunch of master students, measured them in the lab, looked at how they walk, and this is the waveform that you see today as the ISO 14242. So it's not our typical total hip replacement patient. So it's not very representative of the group who will be using our replacements. And this is where we thought we could try and improve the preclinical testing. So when we looked at this question, we thought, right, how can we improve it, and what should preclinical testing be? So the two main areas are that the movement should be patient specific. So we should collect it on total hip replacement patients. We should look at different movements, different activities of daily living, and therefore looking at different loads. And as I alluded to earlier, the range of activities that our patients do is much more beyond what is performed in the pre-testing simulations. So with this in mind, our task as part of Lifelong Joints was to develop a new, more representative waveform which we could use for preclinical testing. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about the work we do at Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust and why we're in quite a good position to perform this task. So Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust is one of the largest teaching hospital trusts in the UK, and we're situated in an orthopaedic hospital in Chapel Allerton. Here we do over 1,000 total knee replacements a year and 1,000 total hip replacements per year. We have good links with the surgeons and good links with the patients, which meant it quite easy to recruit our patients to come and do some motion capture analysis in the lab. And within work package 3, as you heard from Richard, this is where we sat. So we collected our data, we passed the data and worked collaboratively with Morton Casper from Anybody Technologies to generate a large number of joint contact forces for all the activities that will be collected, which I'll go on to. We also work closely with Professor Stephen Ferguson and Enrico Di Pieri at ETH Zurich, who were very much who did a lot of the work in refining the Anybody model and trying to make it valid and as reliable as possible through comparing it to the OrthoLoad database. And I know I think it's mid-May that Enrico and Stephen will be presenting their work in a similar webinar. So the group, the collaborations between myself, Leeds Teaching Hospital, Zurich, and ABT generated these joint contact forces for patients, and then these were able to be inputted into a physical simulator and also into some in-silico modelling with through some colleagues at Imperial College London. I'm going to focus much more on the physical simulators than the actual in-silico modelling for the rest of the talk, or at the end of the talk. So looking at the recruitment, as I said, in Chapel Allerton we see over 1,000 total hip replacements per year, and what we wanted to do with our goal in mind, we wanted to cast the net of recruitment quite far and wide. So we didn't want to exclude too many patients other than those ones that weren't functionally capable of performing the activities of daily living, or those patients who had other joint replacements. So we contacted over 1,300 patients through a clinical database who've all had a primary hip replacement between 1 to 5 years and no other joints, and they were functioning fairly well. And this allowed us to recruit over 130 patients. We can see there was a good split between the males and females, and these were just some of the demographic information in there. So the reason for recruiting such a large number of patients in the context of a sort of a biomechanical study was to allow us to stratify these patients into different groups. So what this allows us to do is look at patients and look at the differences between patients with different BMIs, with different age groups, and patients of either a male or female demographic. But we also wanted to split our patient cohort into different biomechanical characteristics as well. So how were our patients functioning and what are the differences? Because if we remember back to the preclinical testing, we observed that it is representative of one hip replacement patient at best. What we want to do is explore the differences between total hip replacement patients. And we also stratified our patients through different surgical factors such as the approach and the implant type. So after we've recruited our patients, we got all them to come and attend a single session into our Gait Lab, where we have a 10-camera Vicon system, which is coupled with 2 AMTI force plates. And typically we use the cast marker set, whereby we have markers placed on anatomical landmarks, which define segment lengths and joint centers. And then we use tracking pads to track the movement of these segments. And we also, in this particular model, used an extra 6 upper body markers, mainly placed on the acromion processes, the sternoclavicular joint, and some of the spinous processes of some of the vertebrae. And this was mainly to help drive the any-body model for the future processing. And for some of the other activities of dealing, we looked at stair ascent and descent, and for this we used some force plate mounted stairs. After we collected our data, we did some post-processing in the Visual 3D software. This has allowed us to filter some of our data, add some gait events, and also add some of the patient demographic metrics, which we could then use to collate the data in any body model. So typically for our walking cycle, we looked at patients walking over a 10-meter walkway, and we did this under 2 conditions. We looked at normal walking, where our patients were just asked to walk as they would to the shops, and we also looked at a fast walking condition, where we asked our patients to walk as quick as possible without running. And we looked at some other activities of daily living as well. So we looked at some of the typical activities our patients would do on a day-to-day basis, such as stair ascent and stair descent. We also looked at the sit-to-stand movement and obviously the stand-to-sit in reverse. But we also asked our patients to perform some more adverse conditions, so things such as lunging here, which put the hip joint at a different angle and a different load compared to the normal activities of daily living. We also asked some of the patients, and very few patients, to perform activities that they thought they were capable of and they do on a day-to-day basis. So we can see at the top left, we had a patient jumping. This patient played tennis on a regular basis, and we also got some of them to jog. So we were trying to really look at some adverse conditions as well as some normal activities of daily living. this is just a bit of an overview of the number of patients we got to perform the certain activities of daily living. And we can see from the numbers that we did have a much more interest in those routinely performed activities such as walking, fast walking, sit to stand and stair ascent and descent. And the other adverse loading activities, we just asked the patients who were capable of, so these were much less in numbers. For this talk in particular, I'm just going to focus on the walk and the fast walking conditions. So moving on to some of the results, the two patient strata that I'm going to focus on is the age strata, where we split our patients into 5 different age groups, and also the function strata. So the function strata was, I'll explain a little bit later, but we divided patients by their function into low, normal, and high function groups. And we wanted to compare these groups under normal and fast walking conditions. And the idea between to do with the fast walking condition was we initially thought that increasing the demand on our patient would show bigger differences between our groups, but as hopefully I'll show, this wasn't such the case. So we can see here that the graphs are showing flexion extension angle of the hip during one gait cycle, and we can see that under normal walking conditions here on the left, we can see that our older patients had a reduced range of motion and a reduced extension angle. And this was the case in a number of other kinematic and kinetic variables. So they had a reduced gait speed, reduced peak abduction moment, and a reduced peak extension. And this is something that you typically see in not just total hip replacement patients, but also patients without a joint replacement. However, when we looked at the fast walking condition, these differences weren't quite as clear. So we can see that the lines of the graph were much tighter, and the differences as we first thought would become more clear, wasn't the case. And this suggests that our older patients, when asked to, were capable of performing at a level closer to our control group and to our younger patients. And this got us thinking that maybe age, which is usually used as an indicator of function or health, wasn't such a good indicator beyond normal walking. So we wondered whether there was a better indicator of function. And we know that gait speed has been shown previously to be a good early identifier for onset of things like Parkinson's disease or other health-related issues. So what we wanted to do is use gait speed as a determinant for determining our function groups. So we looked at our mean gait speed for our total patient cohort, which was 1.1 meters per second. And we drew a normal distribution graph. And we classified everyone within 1 standard deviation of our mean gait speed as our normal or homogeneous total hip replacement patients. We looked at our patients less than 1 standard deviation of our mean and classified these patients as low functioning. And we looked at those patients higher than 1 standard deviation of our mean and classed these patients as high functioning. So this is how we defined our 3 functioning groups. We also had a number of healthy controls just for comparison. So what we wanted to do was compare the difference between our ages and our function group to see which one was a better indicator of true function. So when we look at our walking speed from our patients when they were stratified by age, we can see, as you would really expect, that under normal walking conditions, there was a very strong relationship between walking speed and age. So we can see that the older we get, the slower we walk. But again, as we found looking at the kinematic variables, we can see that during the faster walking conditions, so this line in red, this correlation was much weaker, again indicating that the older patients were capable of functioning at a much higher level and not indicating a true, not being a true indicator of function. And when we look at the same, when we look at walking speed in our function groups, and as you'd obviously expect, because this is how we defined our groups, that the relationship is almost perfect, where we look at our high functioning patients are walking much quicker than our low functioning patient. But unlike in our age strata, the differences or the correlation remained the same, indicating that our low functioning patients remain low functioning under higher demanding activities. And from this, we made the the idea that walking speed or biomechanical characteristics might be a better indicator of true function rather than using different patient demographics. And we can see some further results from our function strata. And here in particular, we're looking at the hip abductor moments. And we can see the typical double hump from our high functioning patients is very similar to our control group. But when we look at our low functioning patients, we see a flattening of the double hump, which could indicate a much more pathological gait pattern. And this was the same in a number and most other joint kinematic and kinetic variables, where they were reduced compared to our controls and our high functioning in the low functioning patients. And these findings were also reflected in the joint contact forces, which we'll move on to in the next few slides. So looking at the age and function strata overall, we see that age is maybe not a consistent indicator of true function, or that stratifying by gait speed and other biomechanical characteristics might be a better indicator of the true function of patients. However, both ways that we've stratified our patient groups have been useful to identify a heterogeneity within our patients, showing that our patients aren't all the same. And it's important to look at our patients as different groups rather than just a single total hip replacement patient. So moving on to the joint contact force calculations, we took our 137 total hip replacement patients, got their ground reaction forces and the marker positions, and as Morton showed earlier, and we put them into a scale generic musculoskeletal model. Now, this model was refined and validated by Enrico Di Pieri at ETH Zurich, and we found quite good agreement of the hip contact forces when compared to the instrumented implants from Bergman's group. So it gave us good confidence going ahead, and you can see a little bit more in about the validation and the refinement of this model in a future webcast by Enrico and Stephen, and this is due around mid-May. But keep an eye on your Anybody newsletters for this. And if also just to remind you, if you've got any questions from the data so far, then please feel free to add them to the webinar, and we'll answer them at the end. So from this input, we were able to determine some joint contact force data. We didn't just do this for walking, we looked at different activities of daily living. So this is just an example of a number of trials, and I really want to say thank you to Morton and Casper, who helped, who pretty much designed the batch processing methodology to enable us to batch process over 2,000 trials in Anybody model. What this allowed us to do, and what this gave us, was the joint contact force data that we were able to drive the in vitro simulations. And we're going to do, again, for this talk, we're going to focus on the walking trials. And this graph here shows all the individual patients and all the individual trials that were collected, and I think it shows quite nicely a representation of the variability that we see in our total hip replacement patients. And it's probably fairly difficult to just say that we all walk the same, and well, all our total hip replacements walk the same when we see figures such as this. So as we've mentioned, the data that we've collected and generated in this project is being used for preclinical testing, and this is a 6-station simulator that's situated over at the University of Leeds. It was designed by Simulation Solutions, and early on in the project we actually used some patient data to parameterize the levels of or the extremes of joint angles and joint forces that we wanted simulators to run at, so beyond the normal preclinical testing ISO standard. So it's been quite nice that we've been able to see from the concept right the way through to the production. And the two patient strata that we've actually used to drive this simulator and look at the wear results of the hip replacement are the BMI group, where we've classified the two extreme groups within our cohort, so the healthy weight patients who were less than 25 and the obese patients who were greater than 30. And we've done a comparison of the wear testing over a 5-minute cycle, and we compared these to ISO standard. You chose BMI because it's quite a clinically important demographic. And then we also looked at patient function as well. So we wanted to compare how our low versus high functioning patients produce different wear rates, or if they produce different wear rates. So these are the waveforms that we've passed over to Rob Beadling and Richard Hall over at the University of Leeds, and this is the input into the simulation, into the hardware simulation. And we can see the differences between the obese patients and the healthy weight patients is very little, other than an increased load in the axial force. As you can see here, the solid lines being the higher BMI group compared to the lower BMI group. So there was very similar joint movements and joint contact forces. And again, just for comparison, we also looked at the ISO standard under the same patterns. And we can see again how stylized the current ISO standard is compared to how our actual patients are moving. And we can actually show you some of the initial wear results. So this is a very early data and early results, and these were provided to us from Rob Beadling. And we can see that the ISO standard, after between 3 to 5 million cycles, generated up to 22 millimeters cubed of wear. Whereas when we looked at our patient specific, so this is our low or our healthy weight BMI group, we could see that the wear volume was actually tripled using patient specific data. And this was even greater increased when we look at our obese patients. So what we can say is that based off these early results, that the current ISO standard is under predicting the amount of wear that our patients would be producing in vivo. But hopefully this data will be presented at ISTA in September in London, and that'll be presented by Rob because he's been the guy who's been running the simulations. And what we're currently testing is the differences between our patient function groups. So they're currently undergoing a 5 million cycle in the same 6-station simulator, and we'll be comparing this data to the ISO standard. And interestingly, with this stratification, whereas in the BMI groups we observed a very similarity between our patient groups other than an increase in load, here we see some very different waveforms. So particularly in the joint contact forces, where in the high functioning patients, this solid blue line indicating the axial force, we see that typical double hump. Whereas in our low functioning patients, we see a much more flattening of this double hump, which indicate more pathological gait. But we're very interested to see what the wear results would be when we're using this data. And we're obviously, well, not obviously, but in future, we're hoping to look at a 24-hour daily loading cycle where we look at the different activities of daily living to see what effect this would have also on the wear of total hip replacements. So in conclusion, from the brief bit of work that I've shown you here, we can see that stratifying patients by demographic and biomechanical characteristics such as gait speed reveal differences in how our patients function, and it's very difficult to say that we can represent all our patients with just a single waveform. Looking at this data as well and using the preclinical testing measurements, we can start to understand the relationship between these patient demographics and patient function on revision rate to try and identify which patients might be at risk of early revisions. And hopefully, using this preclinical testing, if we were able to use our waveforms in preclinical testing, we'll be able to avoid failures such as the SR through improving the testing. So finally, I just want to have a brief 5 minutes talking about the data release. So when we started the project, we didn't realize how much data would be actually generated through the project and through the data collection. So we've collected over 3,000 trials. And what we've got through this is joint kinematics, joint kinetics, and the capability of looking at joint contact forces for all these different activities of daily living and for all these patients. And it's probably too much data for us to exploit on ourselves. So in the future, we're hoping to release all this data to the public. And we've already released 3 patients worth with 56 trials. And I just want to show you how you're able to access that. So we've had it minted through a DOI, and if you access the link, it should take you to this holding page of Held by Research Data Leads repository. And in this holding page, what you'll have is information on the methods and marker protocol that we used, which hopefully will help you use the data, so information on our marker placement and the data capture method. We've also got information on the patients that we have released so far. So this is obviously anonymized for ethical reasons, but what we can see here is the patients that we've released and the patients that we will release in the future. So we can see that we've released patient LLJ029, and this has got some patient demographics and the activities of daily living that they performed during the data capture. And there's a couple of other patients, the 3 patients that we're releasing here. And then finally onto the data, which should be quite simply to download using this button here. And what you will download is a number of C3D files with their stacked files. So any motion capture software that you have, any free, such as Mocha or Visual 3D, or indeed the Anybody software, you'll be able to use this data to look at the data and use as you wish. Let's just go back to my slideshow. And as I've said, in the next few months or few years, we're hoping to release more of this data once we've finished publishing from it, and we've done everything that we can with it. And I know that Anybody are also releasing the leads model, the specific leads model that we've used to generate our joint contact forces. So it should make it easy enough for people who want to use our data with the Anybody model to combine the two. And if you've got any specific data requests, then feel free to contact me, and we can discuss what you want and if we're able to give you that. And for the future releases, please keep updated via Twitter, following either myself, Tony, or the Leeds NIHR, the Leeds BRC, and we'll keep you updated that way. And I'd just like to acknowledge some of my colleagues at Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust and University of Leeds, and particularly the guys at Anybody, so Michael, Casper and Morton, and then our colleagues at BTHC, Rick, Enrico and Stephen, and our funding bodies, Leeds NIHR Biomedical Research Centre for the infrastructure they provide us support in this work, and obviously the EU for funding the project. And I'd just like to say thanks for listening, and as I said, this is just an example of when I asked if our patients have got any specific movements they want collecting. We had one of our patients having a little dance in the lab. So I thought I'd finish on that note, and please feel free to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for the nice presentation. I want to second that. If you have any questions, now is a good time to find the questions pane and then ask the question, and then we will get to them at that in a minute or two. So David, I'll take the presenter role back, and then I'll just mute you until we'll bring you back at the questions and answers session. So I hope you can all see my slideshow now again. So as David mentioned, we're planning another webcast on the LifeLongJoints project, and this time it's about the musculoskeletal validation and the bear simulation. And this will be our presenters at that point will be Professor Stephen J. Ferguson from Laboratory of Orthopedic Technology in ETH Zurich, and Enrico De Piri. And Enrico is one of the main drivers behind improving the musculoskeletal model, and also about this musculoskeletal model that you saw that David used to generate the joint loads. And as part of this webcast here, we believe we will simply make the model public for everyone to use, so that when you download data from the Leeds data repository, you will be able to use them directly with Anybody by making the model available. With that, we are coming to the end. I just want to point your attention to some of the upcoming webcasts that we have. First of all, you can of course find previous webcasts on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and search for Anybody Tech, you will find our YouTube channel. You can find old webcasts there. The webcast that you're watching now will also be available in there in a week or so. So we'll send that out by email as a follow-up. Next week, on the 26th of April, we have a webcast on model validation using the anatomical reachable 3D workspace. And this is by a guy called Miguel Castro from Aalborg University. And the talk that Miguel is talking about is about some of the tools he used to develop a new exoskeleton, a very lightweight exoskeleton that shoots the human shoulder very neatly. And I think Miguel will also at the webcast talk a little bit about his invention. And Miguel was recently at the Vericon conference where he won the grand prize for his talks and for the EXO. So I think this is a webcast to watch. You can also go to our homepage and find event dates and also publication lists of everyone who used anybody in the future and published with it. Future events, the 24th of April, we are present at a workshop. It's a project called NEMO at the OASI World Congress. You can meet us there. And in May at the Qualisys user meeting in Sweden, we'll also be present. Other than that, I think that brings us to the end. So it's time for questions again. So David, I'll just bring you back, and then I'll see if there are any good questions in the questions and answers pane here. So yeah, I think there is one. Let's take the first one. Is a high BMI maybe connected with less activity and insufficient lubrication of the artificial joint? Do you have any good inputs on that, David?
It could possibly be, although I'm not a sort of artificial joint expert by any means. But one thing that we were looking to do when we look at a 24-hour loading cycle was look at a highly active patient and perform the 24-hour loading cycle, and also look at a low active patient, so maybe performing more breaks within the 24-hour loading cycle, or fewer walking, fewer gait cycles as part of the 24-hour loading pattern. I think that would be something that would possibly come out of that. So the amount of activity that our patients are doing maybe could have an effect, certainly on the wear rate. But again, that'd be much more for Richard and Rob Beadling over at University of Leeds to explore, I guess. But it certainly is possible, yeah.
Yeah. The next question is measuring metabolic cost a comparable method to gait speed when dividing patients into groups? Is it something you have explored?
No, we haven't, but it is quite a nice idea, actually, specifically with the different activities of daily living. If we looked at the metabolic cost of how all our patients were performing all the activities of daily living, it maybe would give us a much more a nice indicator of function. So yeah, it's something that we haven't explored, but it's quite a nice idea to look at something like that. And again, one of these things is our first thing that we looked at for biomechanical characterization was gait speed, but it's certainly an avenue that we want to explore, and whether we can use better or different biomechanical indicators or things such as metabolic cost to group our patients better.
Yeah. Just a side question: how many of the activities that you mentioned have you actually run on the physical simulator? Is it only?
No, so it's still just walking. Yeah, but we've got a meeting with Richard in the next couple of weeks to start looking at the 24-hour loading cycle, whereby we'll be using data in the literature to try and see what. I mean, there's no such thing as a typical 24-hour loading cycle, as we all differ from day to day and patient to patient. But we'll try and identify something standard that we can see in the literature and run these different activities of daily living.
Yeah. Let's take one last question here before we end. We have a listener who asked, did you evaluate the correlation between surgical approach and the functional performance of the groups?
We did look at the how surgical approach affects, but very few of our patients had the direct lateral approach. So the main two approaches that all our patients had was the anterior approach first, the direct lateral approach, and we had a medical student during a sort of an MRes compare the two groups, and there was fairly limited difference. But one of the big differences between the groups was we performed some MRI measurements or MR imaging on our patients. And we found that the muscles that were affected during the different approaches were still affected up to 5 years later. So we did consider this, but we didn't see much difference in the sort of global movements, such as the walking or fast walking. So yeah, it's something we did consider.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think with that, we will end the questions and answer session for now. Thank everyone for listening in. I promise you that the webcast will be available online in a week or so, and you'll all get a follow-up email on that note. So with that, I'd like to thank both of our presenters today, and thanks for everyone who listened in. I hope to see you all at some of our future webcasts.